thanks to all the other typographics folks. You've been really great. I've spent most of my time in the last century, but today I'm going to talk about how the 20th century and the 21st century have evolved in terms of design practice. And I'm going to illustrate these ideas with a typeface I designed in the last century and then expanded in this new century. As a graphic designer in the new digital environment of the 80s, like so many others, I was excited about the possibility of actually designing and using my own typeface in my work. Now, having started as an analog designer, this was, when I started, inconceivable. This is a web press newsprint flyer for LACE, or Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, which is a alternative art space. But it's also where I used my first typefaces when I did this in 1989. In the early days of digital design, there were not many fonts available, and certainly there wasn't anything that I wanted to use at the time. I also assumed at that time that basically what all graphic designers would do is they would make their own bespoke fonts, and then they use those fonts in their typography. That turned out not to be the case. Experimental typography needs new or experimental fonts, so I designed fonts like this one called Bondage Bold. And this is an example of what Stephen Heller called Cult of the Ugly. And it's what I called my work. For Bondage Bold, I wanted something that was like Accidents Grotesque, because I was a huge Wolfgang Weingart fan. But I also wanted it to be friendlier and more American looking, like Cooper Black. And I wanted to incorporate some aspects of the Highway Gothic typeface because I had been using it for quite a while by basically pasting it together from this U.S. State Department signage manual. That's what you had to do that kind of thing back in the analog days. Even though it started off as a grotesque or a Gothic, with all the kind of weird things I added to it and all the geometric details, it ends up looking like a geometric sans, but you're not going to mistake it for Futura. I also wanted this typeface to be unlike all previous typefaces in that it would be formally unpredictable. It would not be obediently following its own rules of construction, and that discord and inconsistency would be as precisely applied as consistency is in every other typeface. Now, this was a sort of post-structuralist approach to type design. In other words, to unmask the unspoken rules or conventions in language by willfully not following some of them. It didn't matter that almost no one would pick up on this sort of postmodern conceit. The end result was not only that it looked weird, but it was a new experimental kind of weird. This is a notoriously ugly poster that upset a few folks back in 1990. I designed this with my colleagues Lorraine Wild and Ed Fella. This anti-aesthetic design was, like my typeface, making the point that graphic design was not just about making things pretty or modern, but it was, as the poster states, to think analytically and critically about design and invent forms for those ideas. Now, I wasn't the only designer taking an avant-garde approach to type design. There were a handful of others back in the early days, but by the mid-90s, pretty much everyone was getting into the act, and the students at CalArts were all designing typefaces, and I started started teaching a type design course in 1995, and still teaching the same class today. So anyway, there were literally hundreds of typefaces produced at CalArts by students, so I'm just kind of going to quickly show you a handful of them here. So Rudy Vanderland spotted my font in my design work, and he asked if Emigre Graphics could release it. And I said no, because I didn't think, anyone would want it. But Rudy was persistent, and he kept after me, till eventually I said yes. This is a detail of Emigre magazine number 15, featuring Bondage Bold in 1990. Now, it was pretty much a hot mess, basically, as you can see, but it was still sort of intriguing enough, and it was surprisingly legible. And it also seemed, at the time, to resonate with people, and it felt like it was of its moment. It felt like it was contemporary. So Susanna Lichko sent me a lot of corrections to do because I didn't know what I was doing, and that was the start of my type design education. My colleague, Ed Fella, told me to change the name to Keedy Sans, so it would be like Gil Sans, and otherwise everyone would think Susanna had designed the typeface. And his most important reason is he said Bondage Bold was a dumb name. So, yeah, so I always listened to my elders, and once again, I did as Ed instructed, and in 1991, Keedy Sans was released on an unsuspecting public. Okay, this is the first Keedy Sans ad in Emigre, and this is 1992, but here it's already making it clear that it's a postmodern typeface. It's more manifesto than it is type specimen. The willfully contradict expectations was a challenge to the status quo and received wisdom of the design of the 20th century, here turned into a kind of high school notebook doodle. But also, I meant it as an invitation to go your own way rather than simply following the herd. This is Fast Forward, which is a publication that was done at CalArts featuring student work with visiting designers. And it was designed by the students in 1993 with essays by the faculty. This is my essay, White Space to Cyberspace. And it's just an example of what the early experimental digital typography looked like. This is an essay by Lorraine Wild called Sampled Text. Some more examples of early use of Keedy Sans. So this is the Keedy Sans type specimen that was published in 2002, so then that was 11 years after the typeface was first released, published by Emigre. Again, it was as much a manifesto as a type specimen. I selected a group of text from designers and architects that I thought was compelling and relevant to what I was basically trying to do with the font. I wanted the typography to illustrate these rather abstract concepts, which is probably not a good strategy for selling lots of fonts. This was another allegorical presentation of the willfully contradict expectations quote. Most graphic design rarely attempts to communicate beyond metaphor and story, so because allegory requires a lot more literacy and a kind of specialized literacy. So again, not a very good strategy to try and sell a lot of fonts. About a decade after its release, the design critic Rick Pointer said, "Popular taste is now catching up with his double coatings, and Keedy Sans can now be seen as a middlebrow signifier of contemporary style." Which is kind of the point I was making with this already in this specimen. So for about, I'd say 2 or maybe 3 years, I got to watch my students and other designers using Keedy Sans as a cutting-edge font for making new typography. But for about 24 years, I got to watch them using it ironically. And that's what the past 24 years have been. I could do an entire lecture on ironic uses of Keedy Sans. Here we have Coco Keedy Sans, Keedy Kanji, Keedy Swiss, Keedy Smiley, and the one on the right there is a design student event called Kaka. So Not too long ago, I was at a design event for young graphic designers when an alumnus, who shall remain nameless, introduced me to the other young designers there as, oh, this is Mr. Keedy. He designed the hobo of the 90s. Yeah, so by the year about 2000, the cool designers couldn't use Keedy Sans anymore because it was too passé and it was just way too out of date. So they all started using Helvetica. But a lot of other designers were using Keedy Sans, but they had very different ideas about what exactly it signified. You know, is it for the cool kids or for the little kids? Maybe it lands somewhere in the middle, sort of cool and cute. It gets used for all kinds of logo type applications, gets used for a lot of magazine and editorial type, gets used for health food, gets used for hipster poetry. This is probably ironic use of Keedy Sans, I think. Gets used in very large point sizes. This is a billboard ad campaign in London, and this is a brand for environmentally conscious teenage girls that shop at Walmart. So, I don't know. This is a favorite. This is in town. This is a local use of Keedy Sans, which I got to see on the Highline the other day. Our graphic design of our time is an anthology of my critical writing about design translated into Korean by Ji-won Lee, a former student of mine, that features Keedy Sans in the English text. Like most digital fonts, Keedy Sans is a global typeface. In the year 2011, the Museum of Modern Art acquired Keedy Sans along with 23 other digital typefaces for their permanent collection. Now, it was a real honor, but at the same time, it was kind of like saying, it's official, your history. And that sort of made me realize that I wasn't quite done with the typeface. And at that point, all the things that were sort of transgressive and ugly sort of quirks about it were they became a part of the, historical lexicon of style and didn't really upset people too much anymore. And my thought was that maybe a new generation could see the typeface differently without all the sort of Emigre, CalArts baggage. And I felt I could take it farther and refocus it. But in order to bring Keedy Sans into this century, I had to integrate a new set of concerns. Quite a lot had happened in the type world since I first released Keedy Sans in 1991. The number of type designers skyrocketed, and so designers were used to a greater variety of type designs, and so the things that were thought of as being so ugly maybe would be a little more tolerable now. But also, the type world is no longer a print-based world. People are looking at more type on screens and in motion than they are in print. Also, there's less interest in the kind of formal invention and idiosyncrasy and sort of originality in the 21st century because that seems to be sometimes an unnecessary distraction in a fast-moving environment with a lot of choices. Simplicity, or at least a feeling of directness and familiarity, is what people expect now. So I added a new black weight that has the effect of simplifying and unifying the letter forms. Keedy Sans Black is, bolder, giving it more of what you sort of already know, but in a slightly new form. Now, with the new OpenType format, I was also able to add a set of stylistic alternate characters for all the weights that are less weird and, again, more familiar than the originals. This gives you an idea of how different it can look in text. But I also wanted to develop an even more decorative display version of the font so designers could use it for making logo types and editorial signage for when you want something to really stand out. So I came up with this typeface, Keedy Sans Blackout. It's even heavier than the black weight with indented ink traps. Whenever I'm developing a typeface, I start using it in my work right away. So this is a two-color silkscreen poster I did for an Ed Fellow lecture, featuring blackout along with some of my other fonts. I also wanted, though, this new typeface to have a kind of outline component. So I did an outline version that I used for a CalArts t-shirt design, and then I used the typeface again for my website. When you're a designer, you're supposed to have a website, so that's my website. And it's one website that actually works. The problem with blackout, though, is that it's too 20th century. And what I mean by that, it has too much formal invention, it's too idiosyncratic and fussy, too personal. I needed to have something that was animated, but still worked well on screen and in motion and at small sizes. It needs to look new, but also familiar and recognizable, basically. So I needed something that wasn't so conspicuous and complex. So I just felt this was still too much tied to sort of 20th century values. So I had to go back to the drawing board. Then I hit on the idea of highlights. Now, it's kind of corny, so it's definitely familiar. And if I use the same kind of inconsistent approach to the highlights as I did in the font, then it might end up looking at least kind of new-ish. And if I could do highlights, I could use another old trope like shadow, you know, for that fakey sort of 3D effect. And then I could just outline the whole thing. And after that, I could just stack them all together, starting with black on the bottom, and then black highlights after that, and then the low light, which is a 3D version, and then the high line on the top. And you put them all together, and you get this sort of polychromatic typeface. But it's not advancing. There we go. Nope. There it is. Went. There it is. So the other thing is you can also use all four typefaces individually, completely by itself, or you can combine them in twos or different threes, or you know, kind of mix them and match them, and it would give you a lot of options of how you could create a color font and what it could look like, and also how you could use it together in different combinations. But that wasn't enough. There was one more thing that I wanted, which was ornaments. I made ornaments in each style so that you could create borders and patterns, and so hopefully that patterns and ornamentation can make a comeback in the 21st century. And that's because pleasure is not the opposite of seriousness. A typeface is an idea, and it's an idea that's for sale, but this one's not currently for sale. But it will be pretty soon, because what I learned from the 20th century is if you don't do it, someone else will. So back in the 20th century, I started off with a personal, experimental, and complex typeface that challenged the rules of type design. And some designers thought it was ugly, but I hope I've kind of relieved a bit of that anxiety by integrating more simplified and familiar visual vocabulary that can hopefully generate new possibilities for this new century. Here are some differences and similarities between the past 20th century and the current 21st centuries that I've attempted in some ways to integrate into this font. So complexity and contradiction were characteristics of the end of the 20th century and the end of modernism. With the new digital technology and postmodern theoretical concerns, there was a greater emphasis on distinguishing the work within its very particular context. And that required a lot more from the designer and the audience, and I think it's probably more than most of us are willing to give nowadays. Now, in the early days of the 21st century, it seems like we are back to simplicity. Now, simplicity, in the same way that in the early part of the 20th century, it was also simplicity. But the 21st century simplicity is not the same old less is more, form follows function, minimalist variety. What could be simpler than that little slab of black glass that we all carry around with us that contains way more than our brains can possibly process? I think the massive amounts of simplicity that are constantly stealing our attention is in fact complexity in disguise. It's as if we are all carrying around a little coercive spy disguised as a sort of Dieter Rams knockoff, basically. In typography, it seems also that there's nothing simpler now than a humanist sans serif font. But that's only true because we've had over 100 years of history and tradition. What we see so much of now is simply a rehash of the obvious with minimal skill or invention. And invention was really important in the 20th century. We were eager to use these new technical and conceptual tools to make something that never existed until we invented it. Making something new was the goal. But now in the 21st century, we're less interested in formal invention because it's risky. It can alienate some people and, they'll think it's ugly. Integration is an easier way to create newness. You take an existing product, like a telephone, and you combine it with another one, like a camera, watch, calculator, or television, and you integrate them into one new product. Or instead of inventing a new typeface, you can take an existing serif, sans serif, slab serif, black letter, and script, and integrate them all into one super font family. You can even integrate different forms into one word. This word on the screen, integration, has two I's and two T's, but no two are the same. The idea of the experimental process was a hallmark of modernism that was used to basically discover new forms and techniques for creating new work. But it became so pervasive that by the end of the 20th century, it lost most of its original purpose, and it just became another word for self-indulgence and impractical navel-gazing. But now, in the post-critical 21st century, the idea of criteria or goals disappeared altogether, and what was left behind is purely speculative. A speculative practice is a kind of academic institutional busy work, but without any learning goals or discernible outcome. It's not experimental, it's just mental. Back in the 20th century, the designer's personal style was celebrated with many monographs, exhibitions, and lecture tours. A successful signature style was the goal for establishing one's expertise and authority. Once established, the designers, editors, authors, curators were the cultural gatekeepers, the experts. But now, in the 21st century, the democratization of design has removed most of the gatekeepers, opening the social media floodgates to the mobocracy. Now we have crowdsourcing, like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe, Yelp. You don't want just anyone's opinion or even an expert opinion. Now you want everyone's opinion. Social media is the opposite of willfully contradicting expectation. It's willfully meeting everyone's expectations. The point isn't to challenge, but to reassure the audience. The avant-garde was a crucial part of the 20th century modernism. In design, there was an obsession with what the next big thing would be and who was doing cutting-edge work. However, Keedy Sans, for example, saw a lot more use once it lost its edginess. The journey from avant-garde to real garde is a quick one, and that's why so few are interested in going down that road anymore. In the 21st century, the idea is not to make the next big thing, but to make the thing after that. Generative design doesn't just make a thing, it makes many things, like parametric and variable fonts that let you interpolate or extrapolate your way through countless algorithmic permutations. One of them is bound to be just right for today, and another for tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The 20th century was not a good time for pattern and ornamentation. In fact, it became the anti-ornament century when the architect Adolf Loos famously called ornament a crime. That was really an extreme reaction to the 19th century celebration of ornament. But it seems that it's finally been legalized again in the 21st century, along with marijuana, I guess. Or I should say pattern is making a comeback. Ornament less so, since most of the motifs today in today's patterns are generated by algorithms. But I still think it's early in the century, and I'm optimistic that the robot artwork will be replaced by a little more human skill as it was back in the 19th century. So looking back at the 20th century, it's clear that in spite of all the innovation and all the upheaval, it was far more straightforward and decisive than the 21st century. One could be much more courageous in their judgment, as there seemed to be a discernible path to the future. By contrast, the nebulous but consistently accommodating 21st century seems to be in a permanent state of assimilation and incorporation. So, what does this all mean for today's designer? What should we keep from the 20th century and what should we leave behind? Or more importantly, how much control do we really have in the 21st century? As always, that's entirely up to you. Thank you.